Hi, we continue in 1 Samuel 3 today after Yahweh has given Samuel the word about the future of Eli. And so we pick it up right here where Samuel lay there until the morning, afraid to tell the vision to Eli. Let's take a step back before we get in the details to see where we are in the plot sequence in chapters 2 to 4. So today we're going to be looking at these sections here. We just looked at this one last time. Note something that is interesting about what we've been seeing here. So here is just a monologue. Eli is confronted by a man of God who speaks to him in the name of Yahweh, but Eli says nothing. And here Samuel, having simply said, "Here I am," to Yahweh, listens to Yahweh say something in a monologue and doesn't respond either. So two words from Yahweh come, one to Eli and one to Samuel, and now we're going to have to deal with Samuel explaining them to Eli. And it says a lot here about Samuel's growing relationship with Yahweh on behalf of the people of Israel, and Eli and the priesthood's decline, which will in the next chapter be literal as he falls off his chair. So let's pick it up here. Samuel lay there until the morning. We can only imagine what it was like to be told that Eli's house will be destroyed, and now the person who he's apprenticed for, and really the person he's dependent upon for everything at this point, he has to decide what to tell him. So then he opened the doors of the house of the Lord. Notice the phrase house of the Lord here, not temple. So different words being used for that, and this will connect, the use of house here will connect, of course, with the fall of the house of Eli. So competing houses, which we'll see throughout the books of Samuel. So Samuel was afraid to tell the vision to Eli. This is the first time we're hearing fear in the book of Samuel, and it's the only time that Samuel will be afraid, and it's one of the only times that people will be described as afraid. Saul will be described as afraid later, but mostly the word is used to say do not be afraid. But the fact that Samuel's afraid here is really an interesting observation, because as he grows up to be an adult, and as we'll see when the Israelites come to him and want a king, he's anything but afraid. He's fully in charge, and everybody is cowing to him, including Saul. So the fact that as a young man he's afraid reveals something about his character. Maybe in his adult life he was hiding his fear, and we just don't see it. But take a psychologist to be able to figure that one out. Samuel was afraid to tell a vision, but Eli came to Samuel and said, "Samuel, my son." And of course, as I note here, it's ironic that 3 times during the night, Yahweh called to Samuel, and Samuel thought Eli was calling, and Eli said, "No, I didn't call you," until finally Eli got that it was Yahweh calling. And now, what Samuel thought was happening is happening. Now that it's morning, Eli called Samuel and said, "Samuel, my son." The second time he's calling him my son. As Eli becomes desperate to hold on to Samuel as a substitute for his own sons who've been condemned. And he said, "Here I am," again, hine, the same thing we've been hearing all along here. And here's the hine in the Hebrew. So the same response to Eli as he responded to Yahweh. And Eli immediately gets to the heart of the matter. What was it that he told you? Notice that Eli assumes that Yahweh was speaking to him. Eli has not had a direct relationship with Yahweh at all. So yet again, Eli has to find out what Yahweh thinks or believes or wants by going through somebody else, first through the man of God and now through Samuel. If we take a step back, what can we imagine Eli thinks that Yahweh said after the man of God has already told him directly that Yahweh is condemning you and your family? Does he imagine that there's going to suddenly be some good news? Why would Eli be so eager to find out something that's almost certainly bad news? But he is, because he just wants to know, as we often do, even when it's bad news like cancer or something like that. So what was it he told you? "Do not hide it from me." This is the first time we're hearing about hiding. It's twice in the verse, as you can see here. And the question of hiding is the exact opposite of the sense of revelation. So as we'll see at the end of this section, the narrator notes that Yahweh continued to reveal God's self to Samuel, and now Eli is in a situation of trying to extract something that otherwise is hidden. And notice the emotional range we see from Eli in this in these couple of verses. First, it's my son who he tries to hold on to. Then his eagerness to find out what it was. And what we don't see in the translation here is there's a please. The Hebrew na here means please. And so the translators left it out here. But please do not hide it from me. So a desperate begging of it. And then it's followed with a divine threat of curse. May God do so to you and more also. The Hebrew leaves nothing in particular here. So you can, maybe you can't tell from just the interlinear, but it's to you, do to you, and more, nothing specific. So it's a vague threat of God doing something if you hide anything. So notice he's gone from my son to a demand for information, to a request with a please, to a purported divine threat of harm to Samuel. So Eli is all over the place. It's all the more obvious to readers and listeners why he's not going to be the priest who's going to lead the future king or the people of Israel. So, curiously, the narrator skips showing it to us and just says in summary here, Samuel told him everything and hid nothing. And we can take that as trustworthy, that he told him everything. Whether it's verbatim the way that Yahweh said it or not, we can't know and don't have to know. But then there's an ambiguity that is interesting here. Then he said, presumably this is Eli said in response, but in English and in Hebrew it's ambiguous. Presumably it's not Samuel who's saying, it is the Lord, let him do what seems good to him, as if Samuel is trying to persuade Eli to trust in this word. All commentators take it as this is Eli saying, it is Yahweh, let him do what seems good to him, as if Eli is accepting his fate. But it is ambiguous there, whether Samuel is enforcing the word of Yahweh on Eli or Eli's accepting it. The phrase, let him do what seems good, is yet again what is good in his eyes, recalling Elkanah's word to Hannah back here, do what seems good in your own eyes, where it recalled Judges as a bad thing for humans to do what is good in their own eyes. The very last word of Judges was there was no king, and people were doing what was good in their own eyes, as if it's human autonomy separate from God. But here, of course, it's Yahweh we're talking about, so let Yahweh do what seems good in Yahweh's own eyes. Eli expresses no opinion at all on whether he's deserving of the punishment that is going to be inflicted upon him. So then as Samuel grew up, and we hear literally it's becoming great, echoing the previous summary at 2:26, the boy Samuel continued to grow, and now we're hearing it again. So he's growing great as Eli is growing small. It's not quite like Jesus and John the Baptist in, say, the Gospel of John, where John's disciples wonder about Jesus, and John tells them, he must increase and I must decrease. But here, Eli's not decreasing because Samuel is a greater prophet. He's decreasing because he's an incompetent priest and has corrupt sons. So Samuel will grow into something else, and what that something else is will be named in just a moment. So as Samuel grew, Yahweh was with him, as he's not with Eli, and let none of his words fall to the ground. And again, there's an ambiguity about who the his is here. Presumably, this is that Yahweh let none of his own words fall to the ground. In other words, Yahweh made sure that Samuel spoke Yahweh's words. But it could also be none of Samuel's words fell to the ground. And that may seem like a technical thing, but when we get to chapter 8, the crucial section about having a king, the question of what's Samuel's word and what's Yahweh's word, what's Samuel's will and what's Yahweh's will be not as clear as we might think. And so for someone who's going to be described as in a moment as a sure prophet, the ambiguity of whose words are being reported, especially when the listeners can only take someone's word for it or not when they say, this is what Yahweh said to me, that's going to be ambiguous even for readers who have been trained so far in the story to see Samuel as great and approved of by Yahweh, etc. So Yahweh's with him, and none of, presumably, Yahweh's words fall to the ground, which this fall theme will be throughout many times, both metaphorically and literally, about things falling or rising up, as we've seen already, as Hannah's prayer song already announced about the raising up of the lowly and the bringing down and the falling down of the powerful. So our section comes toward its end with a shocking statement here. And all Israel, which we last heard here at 2:22, all Israel here, one of the many descriptions of Israel. We've seen tribes of Israel in various forms. So all Israel from Dan to Beersheba, which is a tremendous range, and we need to look at the map to really get a sense of what we're talking about here. So usually Dan is not referred to until way later in the monarchy, after Israel and Judah become separate, and Jeroboam, the king who led the rebellion against Solomon's son Rehoboam, sets up two golden calves, one in Dan and one in Bethel. Dan here in the north, and Bethel just north of Jerusalem in the southern end of the northern state of Israel. But for people for whom the story we're looking at all takes place within this little area. So notice here's Ramah and here's Shiloh, and we'll see that the various battles that Saul enters into and that David enters into are all pretty much in this region here, a little bit outside of, but here. What could Dan all the way up here mean to those people, or Beersheba all the way down here, way south of Jerusalem, which is up here? Maybe it's like Thomas Jefferson saying from sea to shining sea, something they know about but is not only not in their control, but is a fantasy of something that couldn't possibly be, but they can imagine. It's actually not, it does fit the range of historical nation-state of Israel, the northern of Israel and the southern of Judah. The widest expanse ever expressed in the Bible is in Genesis, where there's an imagining of Yahweh giving them the land from the Euphrates to the Nile, which is to say from Iraq to Egypt. But of course, that never quite happens, does it? But another aspect of this is, how do we imagine this word spread? If this story is taking place in Shiloh here, in this little local area, then how do we imagine word got all the way up here? What has happened to want to spread it? All that we've seen is that Samuel is apprenticing to the local priest, and that he's gotten the word of God, and that he's spoken it to Eli. But does anybody else even know about this? Does Hannah even know about this? Or the other people who come to worship and offer sacrifice at Shiloh? How do we imagine this word is spread? It's really hard to know, but the narrator puts that in there, and now that becomes a fact of the story, that Samuel is not just a local person, an apprentice of the priest, but is well known as a sure prophet, trustworthy here, Naaman, but translating as we saw in 235, translated here as faithful. It's sure either way, so faithful there, trustworthy here. The Net Bible describes it as confirmation, that all Israel knew that Samuel was confirmed as a prophet of Yahweh. So now we hear prophet. This is the first time we're hearing prophet, the Hebrew word nabi. As many scholars have noted, Samuel is a bridge figure, is a judge toward the past and a prophet toward the future. He's not a priest, although he'll do a couple priestly-like things, as we'll see later. Prophets are not named that much in the Deuteronomistic history. The word nabi is not a Torah word. It's only found a couple of times here in the Torah, as we see. In the Deuteronomistic history, the key use of prophet is the prophet like me from Deuteronomy 18:15, which you can see there, which is a clear hope that people put later for someone like Moses, all the way up to the time of Jesus, although perhaps it took place in the time of Josiah as a fulfillment as well. We'll get to that when we get to 2 Kings 22 and 23, way later in our journey. So meanwhile, there are not named prophets. Samuel's named as a prophet here in chapter 22. Gad is named as a prophet, and the next named prophet is David's court prophet, Nathan, at 2 Samuel 7, who, of course, famously prophesy that someone from the house of David will be on the throne in Jerusalem forever. And the next named prophet is way later. So Samuel is a rare figure, the first one named here, and one of only a few who are named. And he's not a prophet to a king, but we'll see he'll be a prophet of a king, as we'll see. So our section ends here. The Lord continued to appear at Shiloh, for the Lord revealed himself to Samuel at Shiloh by the word of the Lord. As Robert Alter notes, it's a counterpoint to the first verse of the chapter, and it's worth going back to see so we can see that ourselves. So at the beginning, the word of the Lord was rare in those days. Visions were not widespread. But by the time we get to the end of this chapter, Yahweh continued to appear at Shiloh, or to be seen, the ordinary word for seeing here, combined with the apocalyptic word here, gala, in the Hebrew. So continued to be seen, and Yahweh apocalypsed himself, if you will, unveiled himself to Samuel at Shiloh by the word of the Lord. So we're here getting both. He appears, he can see, he's seeing, which, of course, the increasingly blind Eli cannot see, and he's appearing by his word, which is an interesting ambiguity of how much is sight and how much is hearing here. But that word that came to Samuel also stood by him and could be seen. So although there's no description of what it is to see Yahweh and what Samuel's experience of that is, he wasn't described as afraid or otherwise concerned as much as he was afraid of Eli, as we just saw. But it's a continuous relationship. It's not just a one-shot thing. Samuel is now established in a relationship with Yahweh, both in sight and in sound. So we'll see when we get to chapter 8 that they can talk to each other routinely. And we haven't seen that yet, but that'll bring Yahweh much more deeply into the story. So as we move to chapter 4, the story's going to shift quite a bit. If we look back at our chart of the sequence, we'll see, although we can see on the screen here, the word of Samuel came to all Israel, and then immediately we hear about battle, and the Philistines, who will be major characters throughout the books of Samuel, make an appearance. And suddenly the ark will be not just in the background, but be a character. So stay tuned, and we'll see the exciting and humorous story of the ark taking on the Philistines. See you then. Bye-bye.